This panel is dedicated to reviving the Hill-Burton approach to health care. I think all of you heard Lynn. I'm talking as loud as I can. If you can't hear me, they should turn up the mic. We're going to be discussing reviving the Hill-Burton approach to health care. We have a very exciting panel for you tonight. One speaker who is omitted from your program, who is up here with us tonight, is Dr. Abdul Alim Muhammad, who I will tell you a little bit about. Who I will tell you more about when I introduce him. I think all of you heard Lynn say this morning, and you probably have heard Lynn say repeatedly, that if we're going to have a discussion of health care in the United States, and we do very well need to have that discussion, that we have to start by stating unequivocally that in fact it is the basic right of every human being to have full access to adequate health care, to adequate quality health care. Now, that is also what President Clinton has said, and we certainly agree with him on that. We do have some differences in terms of approach, but we think that the fact that this debate has been opened up is crucial. The question of health care, of course, was one of the most important issues in the presidential campaign. And for those of you who have followed what's going on in Washington, it does in fact continue to dominate the domestic discussion. One of the things that we are hopeful of is that tonight's panel will open up our campaign to actually influence that debate in Washington and to make sure that it actually ends up in a place which does indeed guarantee that access to quality health care to every person who lives in this country. Now, we're going to start the panel in the way that many medical events begin. We're going to start it with a registered nurse. But she's going to do something a little bit different than you're used to. It really is my pleasure to introduce to you Gail Guggenbuhl, who is going to recite a poem. It is called The Creation. It's by James Weldon Johnson, who some of you probably recognize as the author of what's known as the African American National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Gail?
Okay, here comes the lights here. All right, that's close enough. That's good. Stand up here. All right. Dear friends, tonight I have the honor of bringing to you the celebrated Negro poet, James Weldon Johnson. Weldon was his mother's maiden name. James Weldon Johnson was born in Jacksonville, Florida, 1871. However, he was schooled, attended, and graduated from the University of Atlanta, Georgia. He and his brother, both writers, James was the lyric poet, and the prose was Rosamond. They came to New York early in the 19th century. They made their name known soon because they wrote not once but two plays that were put on Broadway. I think they were comedies. But as I say, James Weldon Johnson wrote the most beautiful love lyrics that you ever heard. But just before his death, he opened up the Bible and went to Genesis. And there he took these simple words and made them into the poem that he called The Creation. How God made the world. And then he said, I'll call it a Negro sermon. So he has a Negro sermon. This minister explaining to his flock how God made the world. And the minister says, and God stepped out on space, and he looked around and he said, I'm lonely. I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything. Why, it was blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. But God smiled, and the light broke. The darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other. Then God reached out. He took that light in his hands, and he rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun. And he set that sun a-flaming in the heavens. And God said, that's good. And the light that was left from making the sun, God rolled into a shiny ball and flung against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and the stars. And God said, that's good. Then, down between that light and darkness, God hurled the world. Then God himself stepped down. The sun was on his right hand, the moon and stars were on his left hand, and the earth was beneath his feet. Then God walked, and where God walked, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. And God looked around. He saw that the earth was hot and barren. So he stepped over to the side of the earth, and he spat out the 7 seas. He blinked his eyes, and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands, and the thunder roared, and the waters came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted. The little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed its finger to the sky, and the mighty oak stretched out its arms. And the lakes cuddled down in the valleys of the ground, and the rivers flowed to the sea. Did you ever hear anything more beautiful than that? The lakes cuddled down in the valleys of the ground, and the rivers flowed to the sea. Then God smiled again, and a light appeared around his shoulders. Then God stretched forth his arm. God waved his hand over the land and over the sea, and God cried, bring forth, bring forth, bring forth. And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the valley and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. Then God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun. He looked at his moon and stars. He looked on every living thing he had made. But do you know what God said? I'm lonely still. I'm lonely still. So God sat down on the bank of a river where he could think. By a broad, deep river, he sat himself down with his head in his hands, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought till he thought, why, I'll make me a man. I'll make me a man. So up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay. And there on the bank of the river, he kneeled himself down. This great God who had made the sun, the moon and the stars at night, this great God who had made all these things, like a mammy bending over her baby, molded and molded and molded until until he had made it into his own image. And into it he breathed the breath of life. And man became a living soul. Yes, man became a living soul. Amen. 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 Thank you. The management says if I don't take too long, I can bring you a short, humorous poem.
Gail, Gail, we're really,
You.
what I'm going to do, Gail, is I'm going to ask you to actually wait.
Pardon?
I'm going to ask you to wait till we can get some of the speakers started and then do another poem. How's that?
Can I give it now?
No.
I get it. Well, most people, I think, here
They make me chair.
think tonight have a passport.
The only, one of the speakers has to leave. We have to get.
One of the speakers has to leave. We'll do it later.
Oh, later.
Okay.
Oh, all right.
But I want you. Let's thank her. And we are going to bring Gail back to do more. Now that you all hate me, we'll move on to the next speaker. As I said, we do want to move the panel along, and we will have time for more of this. But again, I think that everybody knows that Lynn has said that the key to the healthcare debate in the United States is the revival of an approach that worked in the past, that needs some work, but gives us kind of the right path to follow, and that is the Hill-Burton approach. For those of you who are familiar with the Hill-Burton legislation, it is not 550 pages like the current health care bill. It's really just a few pages, which make certain basic guarantees. But really, the expert in our organization on Hill-Burton is one of the economics editors of Executive Intelligence Review, and it is my great pleasure to begin the panel by introducing Marcia Mary.
Thank you. I'm going to start addressing those of you over a certain age who already have an instant picture in your mind of what Hill-Burton means. You hear the words Hill-Burton all the time. So you will see now soon a Hill-Burton hospital. This is going to be Keniston Hospital. It was built in 1950 in Marietta, Georgia, and I'm just showing that because it'll give you, some of the younger ones here, an image also of what the Hill-Burton period meant. Hospital building and facilities. Hill-Burton is the common name for a law that became in effect in August 1946, and it launched a mass hospital bed construction drive in the United States. Hill refers to Senator Lister Hill from Alabama, a Democrat, and his first name does come from Lister, same as Listerine, Sir Joseph Lister, the surgeon in England in the 19th century, because Senator Lister Hill of Alabama comes from a medical family, but he was the politician and he believed in the public good. His biggest claim to fame was the Tennessee Valley Authority on how we should have hard infrastructure, electricity and water for everyone. But he's the Hill of Hill-Burton. Burton was from Ohio, Harold Burton, and he was a Republican, so this is a bipartisan effort, a lesson for today. And now I will explain a bit so you know what it was about. I brought the act along. If you don't believe what Deborah Freeman said about how short it is, you can look afterwards. 9 pages, not 1,300 pages like some of the legislation that's being proposed on Capitol Hill. This is the entire act. It was called the Hospital Survey and Construction Act, and it was an amendment to long-standing public health laws in the country. So what I'm going to do is give you a short story, the shortened form of the Hill-Burton story from the 1940s to the present. It's a 50-year span. And what you're going to see is first we had a mobilization to meet some goals of hospitals and beds and what goes along with it. Then we had a retreat, a big retreat, and we find ourselves in the position we are now. This short history, the reason Hill-Burton means something is this can arm us as to do the job we need to do today in general to make health care a human right that we are committed to meeting. Now, first it's necessary, I think, to get in the frame of mind of thinking about the population as a whole, because we are surrounded all the time, if we ourselves don't do it, by friends and others who are decent, but they think only of their family and themselves first, and the only time they might think of the population as a whole is at a time of calamity, a hurricane, an earthquake, a war. So think in the 1940s when the Second World War was over. This was a major event. There were about 148 million people here in the United States, and they had certain characteristics, demographic and geographic, that have implications for health care. Think of those for a moment. We have a view here, for example, of the age bracket. There's the national age bracket, and then there's where you live. The bracketed area to the right shows columns by age of the population. It's simple. From the tip top, the light areas is the elderly population. We have a lot more elderly in our total population today. Those are our treasures than we did in 1940s. And we have fewer young people, and the other age segments may differ. But you don't have to analyze this series of population profiles over time. Here's what you need to do. Just think for a minute after the war. It isn't just age by which people were differentiated. For example, you had among the age bracket of the young working people a lot of young men with war wounds that needed healing. You had a general malnutrition problem. Up to 30% or more of many of the youth were considered unfit for military duty and could not serve. You had other variations. You had a lot of women as Rosie the Riveters going to factory towns. So Los Angeles had a lot of women of childbearing years who needed obstetricians, you would think. And then other places you had concentrations of the elderly. So the different profiles of what the population called for in the way of health care facilities, what age they were in, made a big difference. So this had to be considered after the war. The other thing is, there's still the world of microbes. There were still illnesses hanging around in mid-century that had to do with, there was tuberculosis, poliomyelitis was on the rise. You had still problems from some areas lacking clean water and sanitation. So you had some unbeaten problems. But the mood for an echelon of the country who was morally thinking about it is, okay, we have these problems, why not fight? Fighting a war made fighting disease seem only right. And in particular, there were many new advances that could be used against disease. The drug, streptomycin, was developed in 1944. Other technologies, blood plasma first became in use in 1940. You had mobile medical care systems, even dentist offices on wheels. So why not universal health care, as a matter of fact, if you have the population here and the techniques here? Now, I'm not making a political history tonight, but in brief, that is what universal health care, in fact, is what President Roosevelt said in his 1944 State of the Union address. He called for an economic Bill of Rights. He died soon after that and was never to spell this out. His successor, Harry Truman, when he became president, also called for universal health care. There was a great deal of opposition. That's a story in itself. But you may have noticed a month ago when President Clinton and Hillary Clinton went to Missouri, where Harry Truman is from, in order to make the point that they wanted to resume the fight launched 50 years ago for universal health care. This is the real story, that Harry Truman was trying to have universal health care, or at least there was a faction in the country going for it. It never came to pass. Hill-Burton overall was not universal health care spelled out in detail. But In fact, it was a bipartisan effort that pointed the direction to the physical resources that could provide universal health care in the near future. So that's what I'll now give you a short picture of, and I'm going to focus on what it explicitly mentioned, which was beds and hospitals. Now, one thing is you had a big need for hospitals and beds. This is, you don't need to study it in detail. This is a map of the United States just before the war, in other words, mid-century, and all of those black counties, there's about 12 or 1,300 of them, have no hospitals with community general use beds at all, not one. Only the white counties shown have some hospitals with general use beds. And there's 3,000 some counties in the United States. So there was a big need for doing something physical to provide care. So that was the motivation of a lot of the bipartisanship that went into this Hospital Construction Act. Now, by the way, we tend to take hospitals for granted. I want to point out that before the 19th century and all the work on microbes and antisepsis and so forth, hospitals was a place you might want to stay away from if you had any means to have yourself taken care of elsewhere. Here's a picture of the history of hospitals in the United States. There were only about 1,000 of them in around 1900 in the United States. But the next slide will show a picture of the hospital that was characteristic of the federal hospital. It was for disabled seamen. In 1798, the Disabled Seamen and Military Act was passed, and those were the only federal hospitals. This is down in New Orleans. And so that's why the public health logo of the United States has an anchor on it, because of this heritage. But in fact, Hill-Burton is the first to go on a federal drive for the human right of health care. The others was specialized for the military. Okay, what did it say? I'll show you the first page of it so you get the flavor of it in the next image while we look at the purpose of the act. It said 3 things. 1, inventory your existing hospitals in your states where you are. Secondly, survey where you need to build them. And thirdly, here's some money. Find some money also on your own to construct them. Now, what it did was get very specific. I will not read the 9 pages, but it's simple. It began with physical geography, as was being discussed this morning. What you should do is that you should have about 4 1/2 beds for community use per 1,000 of your people, except in states where you have less than 12 and more than 6 persons per square mile. Then you need 5 beds per 1,000 people. And in states where you have only 6 people or fewer per square mile, in other words, very sparsely settled, you need 5 1/2 beds per 1,000 people, because it's hard to travel and you need to stay longer, and this is the kind of ratio you need. Now, this was considered the standard, and this went into law for the whole country. And on top of this, there were specified what kind of additional beds you needed for specialty care. Remember, tuberculosis, which should be separated and treated separately, and these kinds of special needs. But the community beds we're talking about were for things like falling off your porch, having a baby, having appendicitis, things that happen in life. And there ought to be beds for them and adequate care. Who should get it? I'll close in discussing the act by reading exactly. There should be adequate hospital facilities for the people residing in a state without discrimination on account of race, creed, or color, and shall provide for adequate hospital facilities for persons unable to pay therefor. That's the Hill-Burton Act. What happened is a mass construction program, and the infrastructure building boom started within a year. States set up committees, they did their geographic analysis, wrote reports, and broke ground. You could look up your own state's report of the time. It was, if you want to, for interest's sake, we looked up a few at the National Medical Library, which is called the Lister Hill Library in Maryland, and I'll show you the results later. But what happened is over a 15 to 20 year period, 6,900 hospitals got assistance. They either got an additional wing or they were built from the ground up. This is from 1947 to 1975. Every year, thousands of beds were added. What we should do is take a quick look at this in a rural area and an urban area. So let's go to Georgia, which was one of the states that had the fewest beds and has a lot of counties and hardly any hospitals. So this is its Hill-Burton report in 1954, the hospital construction program in Georgia. So we can look at some of the hospitals that were actually built. For example, there was the Ty Cobb Hospital, named after the baseball family. It had 23 beds and 8 bassinets. And in this case, the money was from the Cobb family, not from Hill-Burton. Much more money was spent from other sources, in fact, frequently, than from directly Hill-Burton from the government. The next hospital is a wing of the Grady Hospital in Atlanta, the Hugh Spalding wing, which was built in 1952, 116 beds and 33 bassinets. Now, this also exemplifies what some of the opposition was doing in the time. This happens to be the Negro wing, they called it. There was a separate but equal clause that was maintained in many states. However, the absolute number of beds and hospital wings and independent hospitals grew. For example, in Georgia, in 1955, for the last 5 years, a total of 500 new beds a year were added. Many counties got their first hospital, and they kept track of their bed deficit. It was about 6,800 beds, and they tried to pull it down every year. Let's look at an urban area. I'll mention right now, while this view comes up, that I'm watching my clock too, because fortunately our fellow panelist, Dr. Aleem Mohammed, will be speaking, but he has to leave early, and I too may yield my time in a minute, so they're going to watch me. But to give you an idea of an urban area, I mentioned New York, but you'll hear a report on New York City in full later on by an ex-New Yorker, Richard Freeman. So I won't dwell on that. But I refer you to a book, an autobiography of a great gentleman, Mr. Hewlin Jack. 50 Years a Democrat is the name of the book. Mr. Jack was borough president of Manhattan in New York City during the 1950s, during the Hill-Burton period. So get hold of that book and read up on this. You can look at the next image, because he was one of the infrastructure development priorities of Mr. Jack was building hospitals wherever you needed them. We don't have to study this. The thing that you may see in green is this is northern Manhattan, and he had increased the hospital beds in Harlem and all the way up in northern Manhattan, and he increased the hospital beds, there's another view, in southern Manhattan. This view is simply taken from the book so that you can read it, as I say, and the green areas where it says H is the hospitals that Mr. Hewlin Jack personally had built. So the principle here is that facilities, hospital beds or whatever, are to be distributed according to the the population settlement patterns that require them and the whole economy, rather than to some pretense of the free market. And during the Hill-Burton period of hospital building, there you see southern Manhattan. There's 3 areas in green that say H, and that was 3 other priority areas for Mr. Jack. Now, during the Hill-Burton period, in addition to these hospitals and beds, there was also a drive for X-ray units, other kinds of equipment, and the health improvement gains were striking. I want to just give 3 examples. In only a 5-year period, about 1946 to 1951, the death rate dropped by 50% for such causes as appendicitis, because of the antiseptic conditions, for childbirth, which had been a major killer of women, and for tuberculosis, because of this kind of mobilization. It was simultaneously done with international collaboration against the microbial diseases, spraying to get rid of mosquitoes, this kind of thing. So we can hold that for just a moment, thank you. What I want to ask is my chairman, should we go to Dr. Aleem Mohammed now, or shall I mention 5 more minutes? I'll go 5 more minutes and we'll stop, because we're at a certain point at this century. And then I want to give over. Good. The point is that a great deal of progress was being made in battling TB and battling these germs and so forth. So what was presented is the opportunity mid-century to battle what you call chronic disease, the problems of aging tissue and degeneration. What you see here is simply this. On the left column, it's 1900, and on the right column, it's 1946. On the left column, by size, are the principal causes of death in the United States. And up at the top, you see the colors of green and yellow and blue. They are these kinds of microbial illnesses from bacteria and from so forth. Tuberculosis is killer number 1. Pneumonia, killer number 2. Killer number 3 was all kinds of diarrhea, intestinal tract problems. Only down into killer number 4 do you get heart disease, liver, other problems like that. Cancer is pink in 1900. It's way down there. On the right, by 1946, the year that Hill-Burton was passed, you already had the opportunity to beat back these other diseases. And look, the red killer disease, which is heart disease, moves up to number 1. The pink killer disease there, cancer, moves up to number 2. You also see accidents. That's the one with the spots moving up there. But the microbial illnesses, pneumonia, TB, and other things move down. You do not yet see some catastrophic virus and illness like AIDS, which we can discuss. So I'm only showing 1900 and 1946. You see the opportunity to fight chronic disease. So what happened, in fact, is that this also was taken on, although it wasn't specified in the original 46 Act. There were subsequent amendments of Hill-Burton over the 40s and 50s that added priorities and goals to fight the chronic diseases. In fact, there were in 1950, in fact, put it this way. First, there was a survey taken of what is hitting what age bracket where in the United States, and it was decided that's the way we'll fight it. That was the kind of survey. And there were hearings in 1953 in Congress called Health Inquiry, but where were they held? In an economics committee. Not in a women's rights committee, not in a science committee. This is from these hearings. They were 3 weeks long. They were in the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee. This happens to be on polio, part 3 there it says. And the dedication of these hearings reveals a lot about the Hill-Burton implicit philosophy of how you fight. It says, we should have a health inquiry into the causes, control, and remedies of the principal diseases of mankind. In other words, not reform, not spreading around something, but actually defeating disease. What was done then is they had hearings in sequence based on the worst killer first. At the time, the death rate of selected diseases in 1950, on the right-hand side of this graph from 1900 to 1950, at the time the biggest killer was heart disease. That's the red squiggly line at the top in terms of people who died per 100,000. The next biggest killer was cancer. Then came the common infections down at the bottom. And the way it was fought is you would look and see by age. For example, if you're 50 there, some of you are 50 like me, you would see what is the death rate per 100,000 of cancer, and you would mobilize your equipment to go and investigate who might have cancer that you can prevent them dying so they can contribute to the economy. The next slide shows you, this is from these hearings. This is from the hearing. The next slide shows you the distribution of the cancer detection clinics in 1953 so that you could survey what is your physical ability to go out and detect in which age bracket who might get something and detect it at an early stage, treat it, and get them back to work so the economy will not lose man days to these unnecessary diseases. In 1954, the Hill-Burton Act was amended under Eisenhower, as it were, to implement expanding what you see here. This was just one example. I won't take any more examples now, but on the microbial disease front, in fact, what happened is that There was also advances because in 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine began to be administered in a universal way. This was given universally to a target population, not given optionally or selectively to a few people, with great results and saving billions of dollars. And there were other 1963, the anti-measles vaccine was developed. So this was a broad front on disease, and later on in the 50s also, the Hill-Burton Act was amended so that there could be research money to fight in pure biomedical science how you could approach these things, in addition to just providing the equipment. Now, what I think we should do at this point, this shows the success of this drive, is I could leave it here, and what I'm going to come back on at a certain point whenever the chairman wants in the panel is I will show you the retreat side, how we fell from this commitment, and we have reached the stage today of the resurgence of tuberculosis, the appearance of AIDS, and the next speaker is an expert on these and other things. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
In introducing our next speaker, I want to tell you that over the course of the last couple of years, many of you have heard him speak in different capacities. As a public health professional, I first came across Dr. Muhammad because he was the only healthcare professional outside of the ICLC who was willing to tell the truth about the AIDS epidemic. And that was before I knew him personally. It was quite a number of years ago. Since that time, Dr. Muhammad has distinguished himself in this field. He traveled to Africa in something which should not have been particularly controversial, but was considered very controversial and still is considered controversial. He brought back a promising and revolutionary new treatment for AIDS. He not only began treating patients here in the United States, but through a vigorous campaign run in virtually every major population center in the United States, he forced the National Institute of Health to agree to conduct clinical trials on this new treatment modality, trials that we anxiously await the commencement of. Today, he serves as the medical director of the Abundant Life Clinic and as the Minister of Health for Minister Louis Farrakhan's organization, the Nation of Islam. I'm very proud to count him among our friends, and I'm even more proud to introduce him today as a colleague and a fellow healthcare professional. It's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Abdul Ali Muhammad.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. First, let me say that I'm very happy to be here once again. This is not my first time addressing this conference. The first time, I believe, was in 1990 when I was running for Congress. But since that time, I've returned to my senses and realized that I'm a much better doctor than I am a politician. I want to thank Dr. Freeman for her wonderful introduction. And unfortunately, I do have to keep another engagement, so I have to make my remarks brief. As a matter of fact, they only gave me 20 minutes to begin with, which is an impossible task, but I will do my best. I think that we already had a very wonderful introduction into what should be the approach to delivering a rational health care delivery system for the American people. I want to talk about two things. The first has to do with the health care reform debate that is taking place. And the basic premise is this, that for many populations in the United States, specifically the black population, Hispanic populations, and Native American populations, health care reform must translate into health parity. That means that the issuance of a magic red, white, and blue card that says to everyone that you are entitled to health care is virtually meaningless to large segments of our population. Because an individual, for example, living in far southeast Washington, D.C., who has need of health services will already be aware of the fact that there is not a single doctor anywhere close to where he or she lives. There is no clinic in the neighborhood. There are no nearby hospitals. And so despite the possession of the magic health card, there will still be the necessity of an hour and a half or 2-hour ride on a bus from where they are living to where they may receive care. And when they arrive at GW or when they arrive at Georgetown, because they are from far southeast and because they don't look like the right kind of people, and because they may not use the King's English, shall we say, and because they may not display what is considered to be the appropriate cultural values, despite the fact that they are in possession of the red, white, and blue magic health card, they may not receive what other people will receive. I think it's instructive for us to realize that this is a historic moment in the history of this country where these issues are being debated. But we must not assume that the debate means the same thing for everybody. For example, most people don't realize that at the turn of the century, in the year 1900, there were 13 predominantly black medical schools functioning in the United States, producing medical practitioners of all sorts. Shortly after the turn of the century, someone said, well, what we need to do is form a national commission to study medical standards at these medical schools. And in the aftermath of their report, the 13 schools were reduced to the 2 that became famous, Meharry in Nashville and Howard University in Washington, D.C. And the actual number of black physicians in this country began to decline to about 6,000 at the time that I attended medical school from 1971 to 1975. There are now 4 black medical schools, although the 2 new ones, Charles Drew in Los Angeles and Morehouse in Atlanta, are not really full-fledged and up to speed. So what we find in the African American community is an aged physician population that numbers no more than 16,000, serving an African American population of approximately 32 million. This means that there is approximately 1 physician in the black community for every 2,000 residents. This is a third world standard, if you will. This is what you would find in Haiti or the Dominican Republic. This is what you would find all over Africa and Ibero-America. Compare it to the doctor-patient ratio that one would find in Israel or in Europe in general or in the United States, where there would be approximately one physician for every 250 people. When you have a doctor-patient ratio of one doctor for every 2,000 individuals, then it is literally impossible from the standpoint of manpower to actually deliver a level of health care that can raise the standards for that community. The same is true for dentists, pharmacists, healthcare workers of all sorts. In the beginning of this century, there were numerous nursing schools, a network of community hospitals that served the black communities. In recent years, my understanding is that there are no longer any community-based nursing schools in the black community, only a few remaining in certain universities. And the majority of the community-based hospitals that once operated in the black communities have been shut down or at best have fallen on hard times. What is needed at this time to be injected into the health care debate is a recognition of the fact that there has to be a net investment in health care infrastructure so that there will be the ability to produce the army of health care workers that would be necessary in order for disadvantaged segments of the population to achieve health parity by a date certain. If we want to use the doctor-patient ratio as a standard to measure the ability to deliver health care, then what the African American community has to have is a net increase of 112,000 physicians just to be brought onto a par with all other communities within the United States. In order to produce 112,000 physicians, which is necessary to achieve health parity, then there will have to be the construction of at least 12 and possibly as high as 20 new medical schools to train doctors of all sorts, but especially those in primary care areas, nurses, technologists, etc. If we enact health care reform, so-called, that does not involve this net investment in health care infrastructure for disadvantaged segments of our population, then health care reform will be a cruel hoax and a fraud. So I think that the approach, making use of the tradition of Hill-Burton, is an appropriate one. But we must take into consideration the special needs that may exist in various populations throughout the country. Not only the black population, but other disadvantaged populations, including the rural populations, which in many cases are even in a worse situation than what we find in the black areas of urban America. Now, the second part of my remarks has to do with AIDS. And what I want to briefly put forward is something that was first published in the Final Call newspaper 3 years ago, and the outline of which was put together by myself and my colleague, Dr. Barbara Justice in New York, while we were in Kenya exactly 3 years ago, learning what the Kenyans were doing when they woke up to realize at that time that 8% of their population had already been infected with HIV. Now, the infection rate in Kenya is at least 11 to 12%, and more than likely higher than that. This 9-point program is a rational alternative to the perverse and criminal public health policy that has been in effect in this country and indeed throughout the world since the beginning of this epidemic. And I think that these 9 points need further development and dialogue, and then followed up by political action at the appropriate levels to ensure that the American people and the world's people are properly protected from this epidemic that threatens to exterminate the human population of this planet. The first point is that there must be a proper acknowledgement of the problem. There is virtually no government on the face of the earth, except perhaps Cuba, that as a state government has properly acknowledged the threat that HIV poses to its population. If the President of the United States is charged by the Constitution to protect the common welfare of the citizens of the United States, then every single one of the last 3 sitting presidents could be tried and impeached for failure to live up to their constitutional duties. Part of the problem of acknowledgement, proper acknowledgement of the disease by governments and by the population in general has been the misrepresentation of the epidemic as a problem that seems to afflict only certain high-risk groups, with the identification of AIDS as a homosexual or IV drug abusing or IV drug abusers disease. Then that meant that the majority of the population went to sleep feeling that it was none of their concern. And unfortunately, as a result of that early propaganda that continues to this day, large segments of the American population don't realize that they are directly threatened by the spread of this epidemic. We have to acknowledge the apparent unreadiness of any government to fully address the issue of AIDS, which is inherently revolutionary. And in many cases, an acknowledgement of the threat of AIDS would mean that the present governmental structure that exists in many parts of the world, and even in this part of the world, would have to be radically adjusted, shall we say. Point number 2 is that following the acknowledgement, the awakening of the population to the threat, then that needs to be coupled with a proper and accurate education of the population of the nature of the threat. We have already, all of us, received an education about AIDS, but it is an improper education. It is improper in that it has left the overwhelming majority of the people who have received this kind of AIDS education ignorant about the most important fact that could be known about it, which is to say that every single member of society has a right to know and should know what their individual HIV status is. If you don't know what your HIV status is, then it means that you don't know enough about AIDS, and you don't know the most important thing about AIDS. It is because of the ignorance of most people about their HIV status that this disease continues to spread unawares among large segments of the population. In order for individuals to become aware of their HIV status, this means that there must be a policy of full-scale, comprehensive, mandatory testing of all at-risk persons throughout the world. The arguments that have been put forward against universal testing are bogus, and I'm sure you're well aware of some of those arguments. One of them has been that it would not be cost-effective to test everyone, since the incidence of infection is said to be low. Well, I want to announce that one of our colleagues on the West Coast has developed a test for HIV-1 and HIV-2 based on the most advanced use of membrane chemistry, a test that can take place anywhere without the need for electrical power or special equipment or even special training for those who would administer it. The test is 99.9% accurate and delivers results on the spot within 5 minutes and can be made available at a cost of less than $10 per test, compared with the present cost of $50 to $70 for each HIV test that is currently licensed by FDA. So the Abundant Life Clinic, along with others, is beginning clinical research in the use of this test. And we intend, with or without the support of the federal government, to wage war against AIDS, beginning with proper education and testing right in the communities, because this is a test that can be done inside someone's home, it can be done in a church, it can be done on a playground, it can be done virtually anywhere, and deliver in as confidential a way as is necessary test results in a matter of minutes. And then if unfortunately the test is positive, then that individual needs to receive the proper supportive counseling that will enable them to psychologically cope with the challenge that AIDS now presents to their future survival. And of course, those who would find that they are HIV negative need a different kind of counseling, but one that enables them to avoid becoming infected in the future. Those who require treatment should have made available to them the very best treatment that is known in the world. Certainly, by this time, late in 1994, that should not include toxic drugs such as AZT and DDI and DDC, which have been shown to be ineffective across the board. Our research and the research of others, especially in Kenya, has shown that the most promising avenue of treatment is the use of low-dose oral alpha interferon. We believe that alpha interferon, along with other cytokines that have immune modulatory properties, should be the avenue of research and treatment that is made available to all who require it. Point number 6 is that there should be a program of crash research to find solutions to this problem. We have the example of what happens when there is proper leadership in President Kennedy's call for a program to put a man on the moon in the decade of the 60s, because he exerted proper leadership and vision. That task was accomplished. Because there has been a lack of leadership with President Reagan and Bush and now Clinton in this area, the research that is ongoing in this country where AIDS and other epidemic diseases are concerned is woefully inadequate and does not promise at any near time to produce solutions. The amount of money that is being dedicated to AIDS research needs to be increased from the present $3 billion a year to several billions more in order to speed this work. It should be pointed out that as the actual number of victims of HIV worldwide increase, the per capita expenditure on treatment and research is decreasing. Debbie Freeman mentioned the fact that we brought back alpha interferon from Kenya 3 years ago, and that we conducted independent research over the first year and then took the results of that to the National Institutes of Health in October of 1992. They accepted our findings and reversed their previous position, which was against interferon, to one accepting the validity of our results, and they agreed that clinical trials should be done. That was almost 2 years ago. I don't have the time to fill you in on the wrestling match that we have been engaged in for nearly 2 years in order to force the National Institutes of Health to keep their promise. The original start date for the clinical trials was last September. And now, 1 year later, we are facing yet another delay that may be at least another 4 months. And so it is important that the general population, the grassroots people, become involved in this issue to force agencies of government to do some real honest science for a change. What they are used to doing is political science in the worst sense of that word. Let me move quickly here. The next point is that there are inadequate facilities to produce quantities of pharmaceutical products that are necessary to fight this epidemic worldwide. There are virtually no pharmaceutical firms available in Africa to manufacture interferon or any other pharmaceutical product that might be necessary for the treatment of AIDS victims. We recently became aware of a study in Uganda that was widely reported to the world press, indicating that interferon treatment didn't seem to work. When we questioned the primary researcher in this study, he said that they used Chemron, but they didn't get good results. He said that 39% of the patients enrolled in the study died within 6 months. Well, very briefly, these patients that were enrolled were stage 4 patients, which is to say bedridden, moribund patients. And of those that died, the majority died from diarrhea, and the second largest cause of death was tuberculosis. When we inquired how the diarrhea was treated and how the tuberculosis was treated, we were informed that no treatment was given at all, that all the patients received was the interferon medication sent from overseas. The reason that they didn't treat the diarrhea, which in many cases, if they had just had the equivalent of some Gatorade, the reason it was not used was because it's not available. Because there are no facilities in Uganda, there's no facilities in most African countries to produce even common pharmaceutical products, antibiotics, and other necessities. So we must see to it that as we take a global approach to this pandemic, that the medical infrastructure that includes manufacturing plants, distribution networks, are all in place to see to it that the best of what we know in terms of treatment is made available even to the poorest of individuals in the poorest countries in this world. Point number 8 is that we must have a global perspective on this illness. AIDS knows no borders. It is a global epidemic, and there is a need for international cooperation. There needs to be collaboration at all levels. But you say, we're already doing that through the World Health Organization. Well, I think that's part of the problem. The wrong people are in charge of this war on AIDS. The same genocidal crowd that is sponsoring the population conference in Cairo are the same people who are in charge of international efforts to fight AIDS. And their answer to this epidemic is to see that there's an unlimited supply of condoms, clean needles, and safe sex pamphlets. And that is their answer to this epidemic. So I think that grassroots people, medical professionals from every country, need to form new coalitions, new groupings, new research entities, new treatment formats, so that we can get around what is presently blocking progress. And that brings me to the final point, which is that on the political side, there has to be functional coalitions between interested groups. One of the things that is forging the significant relationship between the Nation of Islam and the Schiller Institute is the shared goal of finding an answer to the AIDS epidemic. It is the work of the Schiller Institute and the Nation of Islam that is creating a certain harmony that is resonating far and wide. And we need to extend that coalition building to all other groups and all other factions, all other groupings that might have a sincere interest in a proper approach to the AIDS epidemic. And to sum up, I think that we need to engage in some strategic political lobbying so that, especially if we look at the Congressional Black Caucus and perhaps other groupings in Congress, we know that the Congressional Black Caucus is committed to giving Mr. Clinton a victory on health care reform. But I think they need to be convinced that even though ultimately they can be expected to vote for whatever bill comes out, yet they should be given some specific things to hold out for, to fight for, to use their newfound political strength and leverage in a proper direction. Health parity must be one of those issues built on the Hill-Burton format, and a rational, forthright program against AIDS has to be the other part of it. So I will close my remarks with that. I thank you for your attention. May Allah bless us with the light of understanding. Assalamu alaikum.
What I'd like to do at this point is I actually want to, come back right now to where Marcia left off, because I think that, I mean, she was obviously building up to paint quite an exciting picture of what Hill-Burton did for us, and you kind of wonder what happened and how we got to where we are now. So why don't you come back, Marcia?
So to review, we can just show a graph. We can begin with a graph of the Hill-Burton standard of beds per 1,000 people for general care use from 1946 to the present. And what we will see is this building period that took place down, and the way to look at, there you see hospital beds per 1,000 in the United States. Look at the line at the bottom. There's two lines on this graph. The little line on the bottom starts in 1946, and the left-hand column is beds per 1,000 people. So in 1946, there were fewer than 3.5 beds per 1,000. That's not many, and that's because many places had no beds at all. Over the decades, the 50s, the 60s, the first of the 70s, look at the line go up at the bottom to reach about 4.5 beds per 1,000, which is the stated Hill-Burton desirable standard. There's a little red mark there over in the left-hand column. 4.5 beds per 1,000. By about 1974, the nation as a whole was at that stage. Many rural areas, some inner city areas were not. But in the main, it had been reached. A goal had been reached. Then you see it leveled off. In the 80s, it fell precipitously. It's way down by 1990, and it's going down farther. Now, I'll say something about the top line, though that isn't our main subject. You see where it says beds in total hospitals, that is that black line. That means hospitals of all types. Military hospitals, you see in the 40s, to treat the war wounded. Remember, we had tuberculosis sanitaria. We had to treat things like polio. Can you show the next, or show the slide rather? There's a good reason why you'd want some of these specialty beds to fall off. Remember the iron lung bed, some of you, where a person would have to spend an entire year, a young person, a 5-year-old perhaps, in one of these specialty beds for a whole year. But once having licked polio, you can eliminate that type of specialty bed. But without going back to the graph, because you can remember, the specialty beds of all types declined, but in fact, after the 70s, declined not for positive reasons like this, but declined because hospitals were being shut down. As of the 70s, and you could call it the post-industrial era, and the austerity drives, there were years where you'd have hundreds of hospitals shut down. Some counties lost their only hospital. We'll have the case of New York City later on. And so instead of the opportunity to have the beds needed to deal with cancer detected early, or heart disease or stroke detected early, the beds started disappearing. What did Wall Street say? I won't show you any clippings. We've all been around. They said there's an overcapacity of beds. You're hearing that now. There's an overcapacity of this kind of physician or an overcapacity of this kind of hospital. So all of that media went on, but in fact, what you saw there is that we sunk below the 1940s Hill-Burton level of beds per thousand. Now, in many ways it was good. That's not not to stay in the hospital so long. That's not my specialty. Dr. McNay, who's going to speak later, it's one of his specialties. You can do operations these days successfully due to anesthesia and microsurgery and all kinds of advances so that you don't have to stay in the hospital for 10 days. Maybe it's 2 days. Maybe it's not at all. That's good. But the problem is we've been eliminating facilities to the degree that we've created serious shortages and the health crisis that Dr. Muhammad just spoke about. In fact, if you look at the next view here, let's step back and look at what you lose when you lose the hospital beds. You lose physicians. This is actually on a state level the same thing you saw on the map. Here we are today. It's 1992. This is just the community beds for general use available per 1,000 people by the 9 census districts in the United States, just a way to keep records. But the point is, in some areas, like the Western Plains, you have fewer than 3 beds per 1,000 people on average, 2.5 beds in the West on average. All this means that there's many, many counties where there aren't any beds. By 1989, 1990, there were 100 rural counties in this country actually with not only no hospital, but no doctor at all, no kind of doctor at all. The average age of doctors in all rural counties in 1990 was 55. And just as Dr. Muhammad was discussing the age of many of the black doctors in black communities, let's look at the next image, because when we lose this either the facilities and lose the physicians, we get into the state of crisis. And rather than look at it today, I just thought you might want to look at it where we had reached in the 70s, because Hill-Burton had made achievements by then for 3 decades. But even then, physicians per 100,000 population, let me just state a figure. Say you need 150 to 200 physicians per 100,000 population, as Dr. Muhammad just said, in Israel or somewhere. The white areas on this map, you've only got a ratio of something like 70 to 100 per 100,000 population. That's many too few, and that was in 1970. We still had a lot of work to do. Since then, many of these areas have worsened. They have not improved. And now I show you a local area. This is precisely what Dr. Muhammad was referring to in Washington, D.C. We're here, you know, in Northern Virginia. I want to show you transparency now of the down below the state level, down to the county level. Don't worry that we aren't going to stay here and analyze it. Where doctors work, this is another cartographer's view. I hate to say it's the Washington Post, but it gives you a quick idea. We are here in that very dark black area in the middle of a several county region between Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. You have in the District of Columbia something like 700 or 800 doctors per 100,000, but concentrate on the white areas. Those white areas, for example, in Eastern District of Columbia, Eastern Washington, D.C., Northeast and Southeast, you might as well be in some impoverished area by force in Africa. There is no doctor there. You have to go 3 bus rides, you don't have the money, and you don't have the care. Moreover, you don't have a car. Down in the lower left in Prince William County, you do not have the doctors per 100,000 ratio that you need, but most households there have a car. They can drive. How far is the issue? So the point is, take the state of the United States, take the county, take the sub-county level like you're seeing here. The black is where the doctors are, and you go to areas where there's no doctors, and the issue is, do you have the money? What kind of means are you going to have? So when people say, if we had all the money tomorrow for everyone to have a red, white, and blue card, health access card, there would be somewhere to go. Forget it. They aren't there. So that's the general picture from the national to the local area. And now we take where we are right now to show instead.
And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything. Why, it was blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. But God smiled, and the light broke. The darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other. Then God reached out. He took that light in his hands, and he rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun. And he set that sun a-flaming in the heavens. And God said, "That's good." And the light that was left from making the sun, God rolled into a shiny ball and flung against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and the stars. And God said, "That's good." Then, down between that light and darkness, God hurled the world. Then God himself stepped down. The sun was on his right hand, the moon and stars were on his left hand, and the earth was beneath his feet. Then God walked, and where God walked, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. And God looked around. He saw that the earth was hot and barren. So he stepped over to the side of the earth, and he spat out the 7 seas. He blinked his eyes, and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands, and the thunder roared, and the waters came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted. The little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed its finger to the sky, and the mighty oak stretched out its arms. And the lakes cuddled down in the valleys of the ground, and the rivers flowed to the sea. Did you ever hear anything more beautiful than that? The lakes cuddled down in the valleys of the ground, and the rivers flowed to the sea. Then God smiled again, and a light appeared around his shoulders. Then God stretched forth his arm. God waved his hand over the land and over the sea, and God cried, "Bring forth! Bring forth! Bring forth!"
American national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Gail?
Okay, here comes
The lights here.
All right, that's close enough. That's good.
Stand up here. All right. Dear friends, tonight I have the honor of bringing to you the celebrated Negro poet, James Weldon Johnson. Weldon was his mother's maiden name. James Weldon Johnson was born in Jacksonville, Florida, 1871. However, he was schooled, attended, and graduated from the University of Atlanta, Georgia. He and his brother, both writers, James was the lyric poet, and the prose was Rosamond. They came to New York early in the 19th century. They made their name known soon because they wrote not once but 2 plays that were put on Broadway. I think they were comedies. But as I say, James Weldon Johnson wrote the most beautiful love lyrics that you ever heard. But just before his death, he opened up the Bible and went to Genesis. And there he took these simple words and made them into the poem that he called The Creation, how God made the world. And then he said, I'll call it a Negro sermon. So he has a Negro sermon. This minister explaining to his flock how God made the world. And the minister says, and God stepped out on space, and he looked around and he said, I'm lonely. I'm lonely. I'll make me a world.
This panel is dedicated to reviving the Hill-Burton approach to health care. I think all of you heard Lynn. I'm talking as loud as I can. If you can't hear me, they should turn up the mic. We're going to be discussing the reviving the Hill-Burton approach to health care. We have a very exciting panel for you tonight. One speaker who is omitted from your program, who is up here with us tonight, is Dr. Abdul Alim Muhammad, who I will tell you a little bit about. Who I will tell you more about when I introduce him. I think all of you heard Lynn say this morning, and you probably have heard Lynn say repeatedly, that if we're going to have a discussion of health care in the United States, and we do very well need to have that discussion, that we have to start by stating unequivocally that in fact it is the basic right of every human being to have full access to adequate health care, to adequate quality health care. Now, that is also what President Clinton has said, and we certainly agree with him on that. We do have some differences in terms of approach, but we think that the fact that this debate has been opened up is crucial. The question of health care, of course, was one of the most important issues in the presidential campaign. And for those of you who have followed what's going on in Washington, it does in fact continue to dominate the domestic discussion. One of the things that we are hopeful of is that tonight's panel will open up our campaign to actually influence that debate in Washington and to make sure that it actually ends up in a place which does indeed guarantee that access to quality health care to every person who lives in this country. Now, we're going to start the panel in the way that many medical events begin. We're going to start it with a registered nurse. But she's going to do something a little bit different than you're used to. It really is my pleasure to introduce to you Gail Guggenbuhl, who is going to recite a poem. It is called The Creation. It's by James Weldon Johnson, who some of you probably recognize as the author of what's known as the African American.
And quicker than God could drop his hat, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the valley and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. Then God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun. He looked at his moon and stars. He looked on every living thing he had made. But do you know what God said? I'm lonely still. I'm lonely still. So God sat down on the bank of a river where he could think. By a broad, deep river, he sat himself down with his head in his hands, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought, till he thought, why, I'll make me a man. I'll make me a man. So up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay. And there on the bank of the river, he kneeled himself down. This great God who had made the sun, the moon and the stars at night, this great God who had made all these things, like a mammy bending over her baby, molded and molded and molded until he had made it into his own image. And into it he breathed the breath of life. And man became a living soul. Yes, man became a living soul. Amen. 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 Thank you. The management says if I don't take too long, I can bring you a short, humorous poem.
Gail, Gail, what I'm going to do, Gail, is I'm going to ask you to actually wait.
Pardon?
I'm going to ask you to wait until we can get some of the speakers started and then do another poem. How's that?
Can I give it now?
No.
I get it. Well, most people, I think, here
They make me chair.
think tonight have a passport.
The only one of the speakers has to leave. We have to get.
One of the speakers has to leave. We'll do it later.
Oh, later.
Okay.
Oh, all right.
But I want you. Let's thank her. And we are going to bring Gail back to do more. Now that you all hate me, we'll move on to the next speaker. As I said, we do want to move the panel along, and we will have time for more of this. But again, I think that everybody knows that Lynn has said that the key to the healthcare debate in the United States is the revival of an approach that worked in the past, that needs some work, but gives us kind of the right path to follow, and that is the Hill-Burton approach. For those of you who are familiar with the Hill-Burton legislation, it is not 550 pages like the current health care bill. It's really just a few pages, which make certain basic guarantees. But really, the expert in our organization on Hill-Burton is one of the economics editors of Executive Intelligence Review, and it is my great pleasure to begin the panel by introducing Marcia Mary.
Thank you. I'm going to start addressing those of you over a certain age who already have an instant picture in your mind of what Hill-Burton means. You hear the words Hill-Burton all the time. So you will see now soon a Hill-Burton hospital. This is going to be Keniston Hospital. It was built in 1950 in Marietta, Georgia, and I'm just showing that because it'll give you, some of the younger ones here, an image also of what the Hill-Burton period meant. Hospital building.